going to read today is called Transitions. And just briefly, the way this came about was actually an experimental piece. I was trying to refine my writer's process, which is something that in interviews people constantly ask me about. What's your writer's process? What's your writer's process? And so I was trying to write something every single day. And this kind of stream of thought piece started emerging throughout the month of January last year, actually. So just pre-pandemic writing. And this is what it became. So with no further ado, transitions. There was a spot of blood on the floor that was bothering her. She'd sat in the reclining chair by the wall-to-wall window and stared at it, dried and cracking, as she hugged the blanket with the paltry thread count to her chin in a feeble attempt to keep her body heat close. Behind her, through the window, the sky was aglow with the artificial light coming from every right angle that made up the massive complex of the university hospital where she held post. Defibrillators, codes, rib-cracking compressions in the horror film that had become her life. To think that the events of just a few days before didn't foretell this moment would be possible, that the soothing calm of a storm past would envelop her. Joyce now had the privilege to have little in life to bother her at the moment, but a slight chill and an irksome spot of blood that she would neither clean up herself nor call in housekeeping or a nurse to do. Her aunt, the complete apple of her eye, lay sleeping angelically in the bed next to the spot, oblivious to all but what Joyce hoped were sweet dreams. No longer was she intubated, and during her most recent waking hours, she had no recollection of the death and resuscitation her niece had witnessed that was, in fact, her very own. It was 2 a.m., the witching hour, and from the 8th floor of the hospital, the sounds of the city were hauntingly slight. Joyce heard an ambulance cry in the distance, and she craned her neck, then swiveled her whole body in the chair to see it. Fixated, she watched it speed down Cottage Grove Avenue and longed to know that the person inside was going to make it. Days ago, she'd had the same fervent wish, that the person inside the racing ambulance would make it, knowing that person was her aunt. Chasing ambulances was much different from staring at them from a bird's eye view, Joyce thought. Considering that to chase them meant the emergency had hit far too close to home, she definitely preferred to stare. Her sudden gasp had started deep in her belly and could have sucked all the air out of the room. Next, she cupped her hand over her mouth with the force of a slap, unable to believe her eyes, but subconsciously realizing that waking the sleeping patient wouldn't make this moment any better. The ambulance, which was just about to turn the corner and head for the ER, had swerved to avoid a jaywalker and plowed straight into a pole. Cleo was dog-ass tired. It was hard enough being homeless, let alone in the wintertime in Chicago. Between the too thin jacket, the hole in his left shoe, and the heroin coursing through his veins that had long ceased to offer escape, but now just fought off sickness, he was fucked up. Living day by day was a distant dream. Cleo was living moment to moment, and as he reached in his pocket, he anticipated with almost childlike delirium the escape the next few moments would hold. He shuffled along, stumbling in his haze, but never falling, and dug deeper in his pocket, searching for his treasure. Damn, not the left pocket. That one was nothing but ripped cotton. He felt himself scratch his leg with filthy nails, and his hand passed through the shredded lining. That felt good. He scratched again, harder this time, trying to satisfy an itch that never quite went away. At this point, he wasn't sure anymore if it was the chemical cocktail that served as his blood that made him itch insatiably from the inside, or the near gelatinous coating of grime that had glazed his skin like honey on a ham. He hadn't been able to bathe now in 12 days. Not since his girl put him out for the last and final time. Goddamn, he thought. She'd been mad as a bag of bees when she came home to the scene he'd hardly been aware he had set for her. Him nodding out with a needle sticking out of his arm wasn't any kind of novelty, and hardly a straw distinguished enough to be the camel's backbreaker. No, he was pretty sure it was the naked woman passed out on the floor next to him, ass sweat seeping into his girl's favorite chenille couch throw cover that had done the trick. He woke up to the woman who he'd only really messed around with on an irregular basis and had never brought back home before, screaming and cursing. A large chunk of her hair was vice gripped in his lady's hand, and she was offering her a physical escort through the front door. Then she ran back to toss out her clothes. Then she ran back for him. In an undignified encounter of fed up meeting lost cause, Cleo didn't reach full consciousness until he was walking firmly in the end result, down the street, 5 blocks from his former home of the last 3 years, with 2 black eyes and nothing but the clothes on his back. It was time for another hit. But that seemed forever ago, and now, as he scratched his left leg nearly to the white meat, he could faintly hear the wail of an ambulance coming closer. There wasn't a soul in sight, and at this hour, traffic was equally as sparse. He'd been shuffling along, seemingly outside of time, down dark sidewalks, in alleys, across the park, and wide intersections, all with an equal lack of general regard for anything further than his one foot after the other. He now fished for his treasure again, this time in his right pocket, where he stored his loose change. He found it there, right where he had left it. It was a moment of delight he'd been saving for the right time to maximize its effort. And since he was now walking down the streets that snaked through the university hospital complex, there was plenty of light and safety. "I ain't never," he said aloud as he unfolded the picture he'd been saving since he'd found it in a garbage can sometime around dusk. It had been nestled in a heartbreak time capsule, but because Cleo couldn't eat, drink, sell, spend, or shoot up the contents surrounding it, he'd hardly noticed. As he'd sifted through the broken bottle of perfume, the love letters ripped in half, the positive pregnancy test, and the red lace panties that hadn't been hers, he'd hardly blinked twice. But when he'd come across that photo, the only one that wasn't shredded but simply crumbled up, his enchantment was swift and complete. Heroin was his escape of chemical need at this point, but his true escape of choice had always been the delicious daydream. As he stepped off the curb, he didn't notice the little red walking man blinking on and off because he didn't bother to look up, nor did he hear the ambulance siren that had been steadily growing closer until it was a screaming alarm because he didn't bother to listen. All he knew was that at first sight, he'd been swept away on a cotton candy cloud by the image of a life so starkly different from his own, and he'd been waiting for hours for enough light to gaze upon it. First, he felt the violent rush of air that blew the photo out of his hand. With that, he was yanked from his innermost thoughts and could suddenly hear the screech of tires and scream of the siren, its white and red beacons nearly blinding him from their proximity. As the vehicle spun and careened into the light pole, it began to dawn on Cleo that his life had been narrowly spared due to an apparently skilled driver's micro decision to yank on the wheel at his or her own peril, as opposed to sending Cleo to meet his maker. "Shit," Cleo blurted, standing in the middle of the street where the vehicle should have had free passage. As the cocktail in his veins added the ingredient of adrenaline, he felt his feet moving before he even realized why. Running at full speed in the direction he had come from, Cleo looked over his shoulder with a twinge of sadness at the photo of that bougie couple he'd left lying in the intersection. "Damn," he thought, and he raced across the street and was swallowed by the darkness of the park. The red emergency lights that illuminated the photo were its complete antithesis. There was nothing at all urgent about that image of Sasha and Jerry lying on that hammock near the Shark and Bake Shack on that beach in Tobago. That is my excerpt. Thank you very much.